Welcome to the National Arts Club NAC at Home. I am Nina Urban of the Fashion Committee at the National Arts Club. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. On behalf of the Fashion Committee, it is my great pleasure who is joining us directly from Accra, Ghana. Following the conversation will be a Q&A, so please feel free to use the Q&A function on Zoom for any questions you may have. We will try to answer as many as possible in the time we have. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Amma Aboagye. So Amma is the daughter of Ghanaian immigrants and was raised in Prince George's County, Maryland. Through their sacrifices, Amma has gained over 13 years of development and social policy experience in some of the most culturally rich parts of the US, Europe, and Africa. Following her studies at Cornell, Columbia, and the London School of Economics, she has run the gamut of professional experiences, from teaching in public schools in South Louisiana to developing evidence-based education policy in Ghana, to identifying opportunities to leverage learning and best practices to develop tools and processes to increase innovation and partnership across West Africa. Amma considers herself an intrapreneur, as she is always looking for innovative ways to disrupt the status quo. In 2017, she launched the Afropole, a brokerage that seeks to connect African and Afro-diasporan businesses in the food, beauty, and creative spaces. The Afropole does this through communication, merchandise, advisory services, and events, such as the inaugural 2017 Wax Print Festival, which included conversations on the intersections of arts, culture, and research. Since the launch of the festival, Amma's ideas have been featured on BBC, NBC, Vlisco, and Co., to name a few, and her media experiences include radio, events, blogging, and facilitating knowledge exchange on African and Afro-diasporan culture. Through Afropole, Amma is committed to the hashtag Build Black Globally movement, a pan-African movement that centers culture, creativity, and economic development through greater African participation and ownership in the globalization of cultural commodities, such as wax print.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone who is here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if you are here, there's a lot of people on this call, so I didn't realize there would be so many people, but it's such an honor, honestly, to present these ideas to all of you. And so if you are on a cell phone or on a computer, please log on to ahaslides.com/waxprint, as you can see on the top of the screen there, because there will be many opportunities over the course of this conversation for interaction and to get your opinions and to get your thoughts. And so what I'm really excited about is the opportunity to hear from you and to really get your reactions as well. And so welcome. So this is a conversation on wax print, wax on, wax off, the evolution of wax print in the conceptualization of African identities. And, you know, honestly, a lot of this, as I was said before, stems from my lived experience and from, you know, what I understand. And then I have done a lot of research towards this. As was mentioned, I held a festival in 2019 with my husband called the Wax Print Festival. And we, you know, really explored, I mean, the idea of wax print represents something that's bigger and larger that's happening for African and Afro-diasporans. And so while the topic is this textile, I want you to consider what I'm talking about as it relates to music, as it relates to food, as it relates to artistic expression, Nollywood, because you'll find that actually a lot of these themes apply. So, what comes to mind when you hear wax print or African print? I would love to hear from you. And so to participate so that we can see your responses, just go to ahaslides.com/waxprint, what's written at the top of the screen. And yes, Joanna has already gotten us off on a really great start. So colorful self-expression, absolutely. Other thoughts in terms of what comes to mind when you hear the words wax print or African print? Color and pattern, pride, heritage, bold. I love that. And I really love that it's really an expression that's being black lines and color. Excellent. Yeah. So awesome. Pattern. Yes, we'll definitely get into that. Nature and movement. Oh, I like the word movement. That's a good one. Uniqueness. Yes, I like to think that that's pretty accurate. And so absolutely, wax print or African print has a very, when people think about that, they think of patterning, they think of reds, blues, yellows. You know, you're looking at the African skies and the sunsets and the colors that come from that. You're thinking of, if you are a diasporan, you're thinking of kaba and slit. Maybe it reminds you of funerals. It reminds you of Pentecostal church meetings. It reminds you of weddings, you know, various things. And so wax print and African print, depending on where you are and how you see it, have really important ties to how we express ourselves as African and Afro-diasporan people. And that's certainly what I want to talk about today. Now, another question, and part of the controversy of wax print, is whether or not you believe wax print is actually African. And so if you're on the website, ahaslides.com/waxprint, I would love to hear from you. Do you believe that wax print fabric is in actuality African? All right, we're getting a lot of no's. This should make for some very interesting dialogue. Oh God, the yeses are shrinking and going away. Yes. All right. And so I hope that over the course of this conversation, whatever your thoughts are on the print, maybe we will add some nuance, because the answer to this question is actually very, very complicated. It's as complicated as asking, you know, whether hamburgers are American. It's as complicated as talking about electronic music and how it's associated with Europeans and the European music scene, but originated somewhere else where it's now not really something that represents that community, you know, in Black America or specifically in Chicago. And so wax print has that same sort of very checkered, let's say, background. All right, so now that I've seen that a majority of you believe that wax print is in fact not African, let's get into it. So the journey that we're going to take today is going to take us a couple of places. We're going to start with the origin story on wax print, and we're going to talk about pre-colonial textiles, and then obviously wax print, the introduction of wax print. We're going to talk about meaning, patterns, symbolism, representation across the diaspora. We're going to talk about controversies in terms of what makes it, especially now, what makes it a bit contrived and really hard to understand whether truly it's African or not, and in what ways it can be honored or seen as honorable for Black and for African and Afro-diasporan people. And then the future, what is the future of wax print as it relates to Black and Afro-diasporan expression? So in looking at Kente designs, you'll note that Kente designs, as someone mentioned earlier, like wax prints, were full of patterns. And these patterns were meant to showcase different types of either proverbs or reflections of the community. The first pattern that we see here, for example, was called sikafutro, which means gold dust. And that was meant to display, wealth, royalty, achievement. It's also probably the most popular kente. When you see kente being recreated in different ways, it's often this kind of patterning. So the orange and the red is quite popular. Another one that you would see is called Ebusien Yedom, which means our family is a force. And it's meant to showcase that cooperation, that strength of family, the strong family bonds. The last one here, which I found very incredible because it reflects actually the matriarchal nature of the Akan people and the Ashanti tribe specifically, was called Toku's soul cloth. And Toku was a woman, a female warrior that went out to battle, and unfortunately she lost, but she was commemorated by the then king because it was felt that her courage and strength were laudable, were something that many people should seek to rise to. And this idea of women being warriors and this idea of women leading battles is not a unheard story. The most popular being, of course, Yasantua, which was a warrior who rallied the kingdom against European colonizers. And so, here you do see that the kente designs existed and that people were wearing them oftentimes for celebrations, oftentimes for festivals. And they represented a pride. They represented a reflection of how people wanted to speak to each other, right? The clothing was, in essence, a conversation. It's also important to note that aside from kente textile, kente, which is a very prominent one, there were many other types of fabrics that were being sold across the sub-region, especially for the lay person, right? The question of if kente is being worn by royals, what is everyone else wearing? And so there were other types of woven fabric in the region, bogolon, various types of fabrics made from goat's hair, leather, things of that nature. It's also important to note that weaving was linked with agricultural activity because obviously the subsistence farming was a very important part of livelihoods, but that it also did present an international trade line. And so there was a very thriving sort of pre-colonial textile market. And so oftentimes when you read old anthropological colonial literature, you'll hear, especially amongst French literature, this sentiment of vibrant, colorful, but half-naked African people in a way that made it seem as though these were barbaric people who were sort of halfway dressed and they were, wearing strange adornments. And it was just so foreign, but not just foreign, because it's okay to acknowledge that something is different from your normal, but that it was inferior and that these things were things that needed to be sort of addressed or sort of fixed, if you will, by the colonial empire. And especially, and it's important to note the French role here, because even now we regard the French as sort of pioneers of fashion. We see them as, the avant-garde, the haute couture. Even the way we talk about fashion still has relics of the French language. And so their opinions on textiles and on clothing are very important. And so we'll sort of talk about that a bit later when we talk about constructions of identity. But it is just very important that I identify first and foremost that before Europeans arrived in Africa, people were wearing clothes, people were wearing different types of clothes, and those clothes had meaning. And they reflected the colors, they reflected the beliefs, they reflected the expressions of ethnic identity. And all of this was an important part of how people define themselves. So now you look at the role of colonialism as it relates to the textile market specifically. So we know that much of the textile market was destroyed in the late between 1880 and 1930. And that's really important because the wax prints arrived in the 1800s, in the mid 1800s. And so the arrival of these wax prints, which we'll get to, were a predecessor in some ways to this import substitution that Europeans were already doing. If you're growing something or you're doing something in your country, we're going to make that really, really hard to do. We're going to make it very expensive. And then we're going to make our products cheap, easier to access, and better in the sense that, you know, if we've taken away all of your means, and this is just like the best thing that you can do. That same thing was done with cement. It was done with crops, with monocropping, so on and so forth. And so colonialism really disrupted that very vibrant textile market that was thriving in the sub-region. I'm speaking specifically of West Africa. And so when you look at wax print specifically, first of all, it's important to note that it was created in the Dutch city of Helmond. So wax print is not something that was, as we know it now, which is, I need to make that distinction. Wax print, as we come to understand it today, was created in the Netherlands in Europe. And it was part of an industrial era that West Africa was largely prevented from participating in. If you look at the picture, for example, you'll notice these large rollers and this large engineering that was happening. And if you consider the video that we watched with the kente and the weaving and the looms, these are both machines. But what this sought to do was obviously take out people in the way that we know industrialism was meant to do, was to limit the sort of like labor intensity and sort of increase the use of machinery to make it efficient and make it fast. And so the reason this was happening was that the Dutch were quite interested, or Europeans actually were quite interested in Javanese fabrics. Javanese batik fabrics were coming from Indonesia. These were very intricate hand-dyed fabrics that used wax stamping and wax drawings to create beautiful designs and patterns using dye as well. And so what happens is you sort of use the wax to paint, and then you dip it in the dye, then you take the wax off. And so the color of the fabric is retained, and then you can re-dye it. And then the pictures or the images that now get that new color. And so this was like a multi-layered process, and they sought to mechanize that process for their market. And they thought maybe, you know, this would be something also that the Indonesians would be interested in. And the Indonesians were like, no, we like what we're doing, and this ain't it. We can tell the difference. We can see very clearly that this is not the expression of what it is that we're doing. There was a specific cackle effect. And it's interesting that the very thing that they sort of rejected about the mechanization is an important part of how we as Africans talk about our love for wax print. So the Indonesians really did not like the crackling effect that was left behind from the machines. They felt like it took away from the design, it took away from the neatness and the integrity of the artwork. And so they banned, actually, and Indonesia at the time was a Dutch colony, and they just banned the sort of sale of that. They were like, absolutely not, do not interrupt what we're trying to do. It's great, this is not it. And so what happened is that Ghanaian soldiers who were fighting in Europe during those times would buy this fabric, you know, in the way that anywhere you travel, you see something nice, you bring it home, right? You're like, this is cute, this is nice, this looks like something my wife, my girlfriend, my mother would really like. And so they brought this into the city, and it was very well received. And so the Dutch sellers, having realized this, thought, okay, well, maybe Indonesia is not our market. Let's take our talents to West Africa. And that they certainly did. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to sort of see what the batik process looked like, because it's important to understand what they were sort of mechanizing.
Batik tells a story like no other textiles about the history of an island people and their beliefs. From early influences of Hinduism and Islamic trade to a demand for the brightly colored florals highly prized by Europeans, batik has made its way from the Sultan's palace in Yogyakarta to village communities across Java, where highly skilled artisans produce batik for a range of buyers and tastes. For centuries, Javanese batik has been made the same way, by drawing or stamping wax on cloth and then dyeing the cloth, once or by repeatedly holding and releasing areas of color with wax until it is finally boiled out, thus revealing the skill and effort of the makers of the cloth. Batik makers often use imported synthetic dye. However, in Java, more and more artisans are returning to traditional methods by producing batik.
All right, so there you saw the stamps and also the hand wax, and you also saw the patterning and the coloring. And so by looking at that, you can really see how the parallels between what wax print looks like today and what the Javanese fabric was. And today we actually do batiking as well here in West Africa, and have adopted something similar. So if you are on AHA slides, I am going to ask you some questions really quickly about wax print patterns, because what actually ended up happening is that the wax print patterns became quite popular with the women saleswomen. These were called the Mama Benzes or the Nana Benzes in places like Togo, the Makola women in places like Ghana, and they became the sorry, what's happening? Yes, they became the faces and the sort of marketers of this fabric. And so what actually ended up happening is that the Vlisco, which is the company that actually ended up bringing the fabrics, would co-create some of these designs. They would name them with them. They would gut check the designs. Does this look good? Do you like this? Do you not? And they would get that feedback. And so it did become a collaborative process with these market women. And many of these market women were made millionaires through this process. So while it did disrupt, as was noted before, a textile industry locally, it created a new type of market for these women and did change the livelihoods of a lot of these coastal families along the coast in countries like Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana. So now I want to test your knowledge or understanding of some of the wax popular wax prints that you may or may not have seen. So here we go. The first one, I have 3 cloth patterns here for you. And I would like to know which cloth pattern here is called Nkrumah's pencil. Now, Kwame Nkrumah was the first president of the Republic of Ghana. He was known to be someone who was quite well educated. We still talk about him today and many of his Pan-African ideas. And there are actually many cloths associated with him, his wife, things of that nature. And so this is a reflection of cloth that is brought, that is named to reflect things that are happening in the time, in much the same way that Kente fabrics were also being named or being used. And so you see that the tradition of using symbolism and color to express was still being used with the wax prints, even though these prints were not being designed or at first anyway, being manufactured on the continent. So, yes. Oh, okay. 24 people got it right. The second one is indeed called Nkrumah's pencil. The first one is called Insubra, which means well, and it's meant to reflect the patterns or the ripples when you're drawing out water from the well. And then the last one is called Achichedia Echi, which means the back of the tortoise. And so all 3 of these are quite popular fabrics. They've been made and remade in numerous colorway. And again, they still reflect the idea that clothing is about expression. It is meant to provide information about who you are, what you believe, what you're celebrating. It's meant to say something. And again, these traditions were passed on. All right. Next question for my wax print scholars. Okay. The object on display in this design is what? a stool, a blade, or a spool of thread. And it's really important to understand that oftentimes wax print fabrics were used to display both artifacts, things that were historical. So it may not necessarily be that something new was happening at the time, but very much could be the case that something was being recognized as an integral part of identity, recognized as an integral part of that tribe, recognized as an integral part of, womanhood or becoming, if you will. And so the Akan word, so if there are tree speakers on the line, then maybe this might be a giveaway, but the name of the fabric is Sewuba Kamehwa Sema Fa Konya Tnase, which directly translates to, if you're going to talk about me, take a seat, right? Like, get comfortable. And it's kind of a gully fabric if you think about it. It's like, yeah, if you have something to say, say it, So yes, the figure is a stool, and it's reflecting the stool that you would, sit down on if you have something to say. And so these are the kind of things where it's kind of like a conversation starter, kind of sassy way to present yourself, and I think that this is, again, an important part of construction in terms of the fact that, again, these fabrics were not created on the continent. They were not conceptualized even by Ghanaians. If we think, or, West Africans, if you think about it, the true concept is Javanese. The mechanization is Dutch. But here we see ownership in terms of expression and meaning coming from West Africa. And so this is what makes it a little bit complicated when asking, is wax print really African, right? Because who is wearing it? Africans. For whom does it express? Like, whose ideas, thoughts, beliefs does it express? African still. And so at that point, the question remains, who really owns it? All right, last question. All right, this cloth is popularly referred to as dashiki in the US, but its African names include which of the following? So you can choose more than one answer. Angelina, Ahrinepankasa, and Yamado. And so this pattern was one of the most important patterns in the Flisco range. It was quite popular at the time that it was released. And we'll get into its, how it spanned across diaspora and things of that nature. It's one of those patterns that you see and you immediately think of Africans, Afro-diasporans. Maybe you think civil rights, maybe you think Malcolm X, Black Panther, those Black Panthers, those kind of things, because it's very much connected to the civil rights movement as well. And so the interesting thing about this fabric is that it is also associated with music and kind of represents the popular culture that was happening at the time. That, there was a lot of high life and people were really into music and people were traveling. There was like this merging between African and African American sounds. And so, yes, this fabric was called Angelina. Because at the time that it came out, there was a Ghanaian band called the Sweet Talks that came out with a song called Angelina, which I can actually play for you here, for those who've not heard this song before. And this is also High Life, so very popular party song. Angelina, Angelina, why you want to do me so? If you're in your house, feel free to jam, feel free to boogie, feel free to take it back. Right, and so High Life was one of the really popular sounds that was coming out of Ghana, and it fused jazz, it fused local sort of Adwa sounds, Palago as well. So it really represented an eclectic time. So it's quite wonderful as well that the fabric was named after this music that was also a big part of Pan-Africanism and a big part of, sort of Ghana's pop culture. Yamado is also the name of the fabric if you are Congolese. Because there was a famous Congolese singer that released a song where Yamado was a chant, and it was made very popular by the freedom fighter Miriam Makeba, And so this specific cloth holds so much history. It's connected to so many things. And it's such a powerful representation of how wax print can be a very African, very Afro-diasporan sort of a fabric. All right, so Priscilla D, I don't know who you are, but you clearly rocked it. You know what's going on here. So congratulations to you for that. And so now we're going to talk through a timeline of sort of like the evolution of the fabric, right? We've talked a little bit of the history. We've talked a little bit of the representation, patterns, meanings, but now we're going to talk about the application. Like, how is this fabric used and what did it mean for the people who were using it? And so we're going to start with the 1950s. So we're going to start with the 1950s. And here I have gathered photographs from some amazing photographers, Madame Chantel, Madame Felicia Aban, you know, woo to the OG female photographers of our time, of this time, sorry. And as you can see, actually, you'll see at the bottom there is Felicia Aban, who is a photographer. She is wearing the Angelina fabric. And at the bottom there, you'll see as well the Mama Benzes. So these are the women. This is a Mercedes Benz that they're putting their hands on because, you know, they want to let you know they're shot callers, they're ballers, right? This Vlisco cloth, the cloth that they're wearing, gave them the ability to afford these kind of luxuries. And so these were women owning Mercedes Benzes off of cash that they made from trafficking in wax print. To show how this market was really flourishing and how important it was for how people define themselves at that time. When you consider that the fabric might have started in Holland and that it was part of actually disrupting the local textile market, that kind of puts a blur on it. But when you consider also the ways in which it was co-opted and used to represent wealth, to provide new forms of livelihood for women who might have otherwise been farmers or fish women, you know, selling fish or doing other sorts of work, this was a trade line that, you know, presented new opportunity. And it also gave them sort of some decision-making power, right? Because again, they were co-creating these fabrics. And so you see that this is the independence era. There's a lot of popular culture happening in terms of music being exported. There's connection across the West African countries. There's trade happening between these countries. And I was really, you know, purposeful in using mostly women here because the fabric is so meaningful for the livelihoods of women in terms of both how they express. Like in the first one, you'll see the picture at the top right there with the women in their badges. You'll see that it was seen as professional wear. It was seen as the kind of thing that she would wear as a woman who is part of the women's group at church. And so everyone gets to wear the same fabric or sews a fabric in the same way. And it's a beautiful expression in that way. And so fast forward to the 60s and the 70s, and you're in the civil rights era. And this is really important because now you start to see the export of these textiles outside of the African continent. You know, what you'll see at the bottom there, where is a sale of the African dashiki, right? And so this is in Harlem in the 1960s. A wife and husband were keen on contributing to a look for Black people in the liberation movement. And so they sort of organized with other business people, with leaders in the Black liberation movement to promote this as a fashion. They opened a store in Harlem and people would come to that store to buy this fabric as a statement. So this was really what contributed to the kind of politicization of prints and the association of prints with sort of like rebellion or sort of like anti-establishment, anti-colonialism, things of that nature. So now we have a fabric that was very much part of the colonial enterprise that is now being used to represent radical ideas, or to represent anti-establishmentarianism, or to represent Black liberation. And so that is what makes wax print also very interesting, its evolution is a reflection also of the complicated nature of colonialism and the complicated nature of African and Afro-diasporan identity. You see here pictures of people like Stokely Carlisle, Mariam Makeba, Maya Angelou, Malcolm X, all of whom, you know, came to Ghana, came to Senegal, came to countries on the continent, Liberia, and were very much impressed with just like how people were dressed, how people were expressing, and wanted to make that a part of how they identified as well. And so you go from wax print being part of economic liberation for women in markets in West Africa, to sort of political liberation of expression for Black Americans in the United States, to the 1990s and the 2000s. Now, in the 1970s, in the US, they had affirmative action was sort of passed. At the same time and so over time, you're seeing an increase of Black and African students being admitted into universities. And so while this is happening in the 1990s, like late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a great brain drain because there were a lot of coups and unrest in West Africa. And so Africans were moving to places like the US, the UK, Amsterdam, places in droves, and they wanted to really retain things that represented home. And so a big way to do that, obviously, is through how you dress. And so, you know, here, the second two pictures, this is my mother and her seamstress, actually, Auntie Mama. And they're wearing beautiful lace, and this is at a outdooring in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And so these are things that became sort of traditional wear, like things that you wear on occasion. So it's no more like how we were seeing in the 50s, where it's like everyday wear, professional wear, things that are, you know, you just wear around. In the US, it's been relegated to occasion wear, or maybe on Sundays for church, maybe for a wedding, maybe for some kind of occasion. At the bottom there, you'll see a baby dedication. So that's little baby me over here with my mother, and my youngest brother is being dedicated. Kwesi was born. And so you see, you know, the cloth there in the background. My mother is, again, looking fly as ever in her lace. On the other side, you'll see hall parties as well. And so in the UK, I know that there's a movement now to really bring back this idea of hall parties, but essentially, especially among Nigerians, people would just come together and they would give a color, maybe a theme, and people would come rent halls and they would just dance, drink, dress up to the nines, but always in traditional wear, and really celebrate themselves, right? And these were, again, opportunities for people in the diaspora to represent who they were. In the 90s, you also realize that now you've reached this kind of point where there are many Blacks, I don't want to say many, let me not over exaggerate the fact that, you know, like more Black people were, you know, entering into university. And so in 1993, the director of minority affairs at, Westchester University in Pennsylvania, wanted to have sort of like a Black graduation. And that's where these stoles came from. And as part of that Black graduation, people were given these kente stoles. And this tradition started to spread, where you notice that people were wanting to find a way to honor the fact that it is really a generational breaking thing that you've made it out of. You've made it to university and graduated. And so here at this first slide is me, actually, and some of my friends, when we graduated from university, and we're wearing our stoles, like related to our sororities, related to Black Student Union, things of that nature. And these stoles were kente stoles. And so, you know, you have beautiful patterning, beautiful colors, but something that distinguishes the fact that you are Black, occupying this otherwise predominantly white space, and you've made it, you flourished. And so there's some honor in that. And so the 1990s, early 2000s were a period of really expression for diasporans who were, you know, moving back, and they're having children, and, you know, their children are now coming of age, and their children are also reclaiming identity. And so there's a lot of that happening. And that gives actually a way into our current dispensation, and this sort of next segue, which is what I like to just deem like the Wakanda era, right? Like, so there's this running joke now where it's like, it's now cool to be African, but when we were growing up, it wasn't, right? And we were growing up, and when we brought our parents' food to school, we were laughed at. If we were wearing like African related things, people would be like, where are you from? What is this Tarzan thing? Okay, Kunta Kinte, all these kind of like strange names. But you see that in the 2010s, even up till now, we're experiencing a time where African identity is really flourishing. It's really proliferating. And you're seeing it because of, first and foremost, obviously music, movies, but definitely also because of the fashion. And the fashion is the most instant way, without someone speaking or without someone singing or anything like that, for you to see that, oh, okay, this is going somewhere African. And a lot of that is because the children of the brain drain era are coming of age, and they're participating in the internet and making decisions at high levels that are allowing these things to be included in the conversation. And so you're kind of having a full circle moment now where people are wanting to own this, where they're wanting to take African prints out of this sort of traditional occasion wear of the brain drain era, of our parents' era, and wanting it to be very normal. Like, yeah, I'm going to work, I'm wearing a head wrap. I'm, going to a party, I'm wearing an African print crop top, right? Like, this is no longer relegated to something that I can only wear on Sunday for church or for a wedding, or there's a funeral or something like this, which is an important part of that evolution. Again, started from the colonial enterprise, interrupted the textiles, but then created a new market for market women, and sort of created some sort of economic liberation for them, then became part of the Black liberation movement, and then became a part of how African immigrants define themselves and maintain their relationship with their culture, and then became part of a movement now, which is kind of like an anti-respectability movement, where people are just saying, like, I am going to express my African identity all the time, wherever I go, in whatever ways. And it's being really accepted in popular culture across the diaspora lens. So that's in Hollywood. So not just Nollywood, but also in Hollywood, not just in Afrobeats, but in hip hop, not just in African fashion, but in the overall sort of like global fashion market. And so seeing that evolution and seeing that the political evolution as well is really important, because it lends itself to a number of questions and a number of controversies. So now that we've gone through this evolution, based on everything that we have discussed, do you think that wax print is African? I would love to hear from you. So ahaslides.com/waxprint, and let me know your thoughts. Okay, the tides are shifting. And I'll be curious when we get to the Q&A to really hear why people changed their minds, or why people had the thoughts they had in the beginning and how that evolved. But this is really interesting. And this actually represents the yo-yoing, really, when we talk about wax print. It's like, at first you're like, oh, it's Dutch? What? Hell no. And then you realize how important it is for the culture. And you're like, well, I mean, are the Dutch wearing it? Like, how important is it to their identity? Are the Indonesians interested? Then you start to really ask questions. And so now, okay, the tide has changed. We see that overwhelmingly people are now thinking that wax print is in fact African. So let's get to the controversies, because I would love to get to the Q&A, and I know that the time has been very well spent. So let me get to the end of this. So the controversies in wax are around three things: appreciation, appropriation, and what I term diasporization, which is kind of the theater of African identity. So appreciation being this idea that, as African print is becoming more and more ingrained in popular culture, it's become mainstream, and people really respect and value its participation in sort of everyday fashion. Like I said, the fact that you could wear an African print crop top to a party and that be normal is appreciation, in the sense that it's honoring this fabric and giving it space in our everyday lives. On the other hand, there is this idea of appropriation, which is a bit difficult because appropriation in and of itself is not necessarily problematic. All innovation stems from appropriation. All innovation comes from this idea that you take something from somewhere, wherever, and you sort of reimagine it to fit your locality. So all people are guilty of appropriation. But the issue around appropriation for Black and Afro-diasporan people is that for things that have historically been demonized, or things that have historically been seen as negative or have been banned in public spaces, people are now using these things to profit. And so the question is that right? Is that fair? Is that appropriate? Is that a form of neocolonialism? If you are the French, for example, a French company, and we'll look at an example, a French company who is directly responsible for import substitution along the coast as it relates to textiles, but you're now incorporating it into your lineage. Is that fair? Is that right? Is that okay? So here, for example, we have the French house Louis Vuitton. And if you are in the app, you can actually vote now for whether or not you believe this is appreciation, appropriation, or diasporization. So this is from Louis Vuitton. Virgil Abloh was a Ghanaian creative director for Louis Vuitton. Him being Ghanaian, he had a relationship to the Kente fabric. And so one of his lines was inspired by his Ghanaian heritage. And he clothed some very well-known, very popular people in his fabrics on behalf of this fashion house. Nevertheless, all of this is still under Louis Vuitton. And so the question remains, is that fair? Is that right? Would it have been better for Virgil to release this on his own, on his own doing? Would he have been able to release this and reach the platform he did without the backing of Louis Vuitton? Is this appropriate? Not to speak of appropriation, but is it appropriate for a fashion house like Louis Vuitton, which again is related very much to the French Empire, which was directly responsible for import substitutions of textiles along the coast? And so it's really checkered. And here you have two beautiful Black people, both of whom are diasporans, wearing this fabric, which is a moment of pride to see as a Ghanaian, non-Ghanaians who are also diasporans, Nigerian and Caribbean, wearing this fabric. But at the end of the day, last, it's Louis V. So, the question really becomes, is this appreciation in the sense that it's Virgil providing some honor to his heritage? Is it appropriation in the sense that it is taking something from the French Empire and giving it and further enriching it? Or is it diasporization? Is it the theater of, presenting, reminding people that you're African too, right? Like the theater of that. All right, so, sorry. All right, so it looks like 55% of you said appreciation, 35% said appropriation, 10% of you said diasporization. Very interesting. This next example is from Christian Dior, another French fashion house that used wax prints. And so I want to show this video very quickly.
Our idea is to translate something that is really part of the Dior heritage, like the toile de juillet, with the technical wax. That's the idea. This is the dream for us. Sunset toile de juillet, tropical garden with palm, with butterfly, and the other side there is the tarot card.
Maybe we can select some of the little elements in the book of Anne.
Yes,
and
in
see how
fact,
we
I
can.
asked them. I want something really bold, less in European style, something traditional, very colorful. For the animals, if you can use this technique.
Sorry, just want to.
Et nous, on est revenu à des coloris terre, dans les kakis, les marrons, les terres de ciel.
So cool! This print is beautiful!
À l'origine, c'est un batik indonésien qui est industrialisé par la Hollande, mais ce batik a été tellement modifié que le marché indonésien n'en veut pas. Et donc, il atterrit en Afrique, dans un pays qui s'appelle...
All right, so this was done in 2019 by Christian Dior. And as you can see here, they actually did go to Côte d'Ivoire because there are currently factories in Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire that still produce wax print. And so they worked with Ivorian artisans to develop a fabric, develop patterns, and it was printed through Vlisco and shown as part of their cruise show. And this was quite controversial. A lot of people, felt a way about Christian Dior, even participating, having wax print on the runway. And even though people were involved in the process, it was still sort of, it still felt, again, French Empire, very much disruptive and wanting to sort of co-opt the look. But in the end, though, things like this do keep the factories in these African countries that are employing African people to continue something that expresses African identity going. They keep them going. And so, again, is this appreciation, diasporization, or appropriation? I'm going to skip that and just go to the future part because I recognize time is gone. So sorry. So what's next? Like now we have these looming questions about, appreciation, appropriation, diasporization. I think what's important is to know that Africans are taking new steps when it comes to reclaiming African print. So here you see styles of batik, and you'll see lines now where people are doing their own hand dyeing, they're doing their own prints, they're doing their own patterning, their own naming, and creating new identities. And so it's not a complete rejection of wax print. People are obviously still using that, but increasingly you're seeing people use fabrics that they make themselves, that they name themselves in the traditions that they deem worthy. And then aside from the print, the actual fashion space is also evolving to include different ways of showcasing Africanness, right? In this first picture, you have a brand called Funtua, which uses only Nigerian cotton, and they do the dyeing, they do the production, the entire value chain is Nigerian. And that's very revolutionary. There's no prints on it necessarily, but it is very much African. In the next place, you see the Bogolon fabric, the Kente fabric being used to make different types of pieces and to really bring back the value of some of these otherwise disrupted markets like Bogolon and like Kente. And in the final one, we have Larry J., where he's using things like jute bags to make accessories. And so now people are kind of looking outside of wax print for new ways to express as African. And I think that that's really the future of African print and African fashion is finding ways to own the narrative. It does not necessarily mean people are not going to use the print. It just means that people are finding new ways to talk about what is African print, not necessarily that all prints are wax prints, that all African prints are wax prints, and that there are, different ways to express African identity. So with that, I will end here and open up for Q&A.
One question was, could you clarify, I think you said it was through Ghanaian soldiers who brought it back from the Netherlands or when fighting for the Dutch army. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. So these were soldiers that were part of the allyship during the World War. And also part of, there's the World War, which was the early 1900s, and then the late 1800s as well, participating in the sort of Dutch Empire. And so there were soldiers sent as part of Dutch Empire as well. So it's both, I guess you could say.
So you discussed this in, very comprehensively, and I think with great lucidity, but of course we can't really answer, there will always be a sense of opinion about what is appropriation versus appreciation. We had several questions, however, asking whether it is okay for white people to wear these prints. We love them.
Yeah. So
okay, that's.
Oh no, sorry. Okay.
Oh, sorry. No, I think you went delayed. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, I think that yeah, I do see a number of these questions. And see, I think the idea is like costume versus casual, if you will. There's certainly a way to casually wear African prints that is not like, you're tying your head and, you're wearing a whole thing and it's just randomly for no reason. Like if you're going to an African wedding or, an African function and you want to dress traditionally because, you have a relationship with the people who are celebrating and that's part of what you're doing there, that's one thing. But in a casual way, I think it's important to just incorporate pieces, right? Like, and I think that's what the current fashion movement is trying to say. Like, maybe you don't have to be completely adorned and dripped in wax print, but it is very okay. And we definitely want to see people wearing it in a way that feels normalized, right? Like you wouldn't wear like a full-on cowboy outfit if you wear, but you wear jeans, and jeans come from the cowboy era, right? So it's like an evolution of that. So I think that's kind of the thinking is like, how can you normalize it in your wardrobe so that it doesn't feel costumey?
Thank you for that. I think, and since you spoke about the controversy with Virgil Abloh and Vuitton, I think he said, provenance is reality, ownership is a myth. In the same way, we cannot control our inspirations, we cannot trademark natural or cultural heritage as contemporary artistic territory. I found that quite insightful, but I think you're pointing out the importance of contextual boundaries.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah. So on that note, who is designing these fabrics nowadays? You spoke to the rich tradition of thousands of years old tradition of symbolism in woven fabric like kente. But you alluded to some of the specific symbolism in wax print fabric. Can you speak a little more to some of the sources and inspirations for contemporary designs?
Yeah, so I mean it's a bit of contention there because a lot of the designing, quite frankly, does happen in the Netherlands still. There have been efforts made in more contemporary attempts by the company to incorporate young voices in the design. I know even right now they host these sort of challenges to get people to bring in their designs from the continent so that they can sort of use them. But a lot of it is largely designers who are sitting in the Netherlands and they are making these designs. And in terms of the co-creation process, to the extent that there's printing happening on the continent, and that there's engagement with the sort of like local enterprise, like the local VSCO, the local ATP, so on and so forth, then there is a conversation on like feedback, but the actual sort of process is still largely happening in the Netherlands.
So, and one of our listeners actually points out that VSCO has refused a profit share with African investors as recently as last year. So I think there's still some question about who actually gets to benefit from this design and this market. Do you have any further insights onto that?
No, so I don't have insights. I mean, right now, in Ghana, for example, the VSCO, the GTP, the Ghana Textile company, like the one that is owned by the Ghanaian government, is half VSCO. So that's probably the kind of partnership that I know of that exists. I don't know of any private Ghanaian or, African partnerships with VSCO. I know that all of the textile, Akosombo textiles, all of the local ones are really struggling under the hand of Chinese imports because you have things like High Target and other ones that are coming in. They're way cheaper. Obviously, they bleed. They're of a different quality. But even then, there are some Chinese imports that are coming in that they really up the quality as well. So, I mean, I think we're all, and that's like a global phenomenon, right? We're all competing with China in that way. And so I don't know what the issues with VSCO are around ownership, but I certainly know that everyone is really struggling at the hand of Chinese imports.
I was going to ask about that since these fabrics are used in day to day, right? Is that correct? I mean, when I was traveling in Ghana, I know you could buy them on the street and people wear them and incorporate them into their clothes on a daily basis, but not everybody can actually afford the high-end prints that we may be familiar with seeing or familiar with when seeing pictures of Lisco. So another question was actually whether African factory workers get a wage for working in the local print factories that are competitive, or that allow to keep this market competitive.
That's a good question. I'm not sure in terms of the wages, but I do know that. So it's interesting that people wear wax print, but unfortunately, it's kind of been relegated here back to occasion wear. So it's kind of a flip, where it was occasion wear in the States and then kind of became normalized here. To be fair, wax print is usually worn on the weekends. That's Friday for traditional Fridays, Saturday for funerals or weddings, and Sundays for church. But during the week, it's usually secondhand wear or sort of European professional wear. And so I think that also plays a role in terms of I think affordability might play a role, but also just sort of mindsets around the place of print nowadays. So yeah.
What would you say is the majority sentiment, for example, in Ghana, towards incorporating wax print into their everyday fashion, given this complicated history? Is it generally more positive or more negative?
No, I think the average Ghanaian, when we did the festival, we went around and asked people, and most people really feel like wax print is African. But a lot of people don't even necessarily know. They call it Dutch fabric. They know that there are relationships with the Dutch, things like that, but still believe it to be wholly African. I don't think the majority of people have that controversy, but I think the decision sort of there's a class of people and a sort of global conversation that is making it a bit more fraught. And I think that conversation is spreading, people are coming into the know. So.
Can you give us some examples of very notable, I asked earlier about some of the sources for inspiration for the designs. And so notwithstanding, the more complicated issue with actually Europeans designing fabrics for the African market, but they are very specific and very creative and original symbols and designs that are inspired by more West African tradition. And you gave us a number of examples earlier, but can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. So usually when people think about symbolism for West Africans, they're often, definitely for Ghanaians, they're often thinking about Adinkra symbols. And so those are the symbols, such as Jinyame, which means except God, or even I talked about Ahrenepan Kasa, which is a proverb, that says, a good bead, or, okay, let me not say the direct translation, but just basically quality speaks for itself. And so some of these, some of the designs do draw from Adinkra symbolism and the sort of subtext of that patterning. Others of them, quite frankly, so I talked about the tortoise shell. Others of them are symbols, it's backwards. Someone presents you something, it looks like a symbol that and so you bring that alignment, like the tortoise shell, which, tortoises, crocodiles, tigers are an important part of sort of clan, how clans define themselves, porcupines, things like that, the clan totems and things of that nature. And so sometimes you'll notice that the prints incorporate some of these totems and incorporate some of that symbolism as well.
Any favorite designs that you have?
Yeah, I mean, do I have a favorite wax print design? I don't know. I like Nkrumah's pencil. I like the simplicity and the easiness of once you see it, this is it has a specific memory, I should say. It reminds me of my mother, it reminds me of Women's Fellowship. It's just such a recurring print. So that's definitely one. And then the well one. The Insubra one is also the one with the circle. It's also really popular. I know I used it. I used to make like bags, and I used to use that a lot in the formulation of those bags. So that has like memories attached to it for me.
So it is really spanning generations and generations. It's not just a I think it has become to more awareness globally because of the factors you described, but it is not in the tradition. And as you described yourself, that is part of your identity because it has so many memories that have to do with your background. I was come out in commemoration or to celebrate in celebration of certain events. I believe there was a famous one when country Flisco actually came out with a design of Obama's handbag. So that seems, a little gimmicky, but I think that has played a role in actually bringing this fabric and fashion to a wider audience. What do you think of that? Is that a bit gimmicky, or is that actually helping spreading the tradition and the African ideas?
Yeah, it's not gimmicky because Ghanaians, like, people actually do this. So for example, my church is celebrating its 1-year anniversary. And so they're getting a cloth printed, and they've designed the cloth and they're going to get it printed. So it's not like absurd that something as, wild as a Black American president is being canonized in a cloth. Like, that feels appropriate. Funnily enough, it may seem gimmicky for other people, but I think averagely people would see it as appropriate. This is like a really big deal. There's an African guy that's like the president of America. Let's definitely put his face or his words or something associated with him on a fabric.
Thank you. Let's see a few more questions. So, lots of praise, very informative talk. Can you say where people might be able to find you and perhaps ask further questions or get more information on this topic?
Sure. So, so that's what I didn't get to in my in my presentation. But I can be reached on Twitter at Amma_Aboagye, AMMA_ABOAGYE. And then on Instagram, AABOAGYE. Okay, yes, I will type it. And then I have a personal website as well where you can get my email address, and that's AmmaAboagye.com. So you can definitely visit me there. And in terms of research, so I actually have a running list of like websites and JSTOR resources that I have as well. So yeah, if there are people who are interested in that information, I can certainly share that.
Okay, there are so many really educated and interesting questions that I don't think we will have time to discuss. I just want to ask you very briefly, how did you actually get into this? I mean, apart from your own background, how did you develop interest in this topic? You did found the Wax Print Fest. Can you just tell us briefly about that?
Yeah, so I mean, a part of it was I'm always interested in sort of like tension, and my parents own a African Caribbean grocery store in Laurel, Maryland. It's called Covenant. So if you're in Maryland and you need African groceries, go and visit my parents there. But I just remember that my parents I was there for a summer, and my parents were bringing in African fabric from India. And I was like, this is so fascinating because this fabric literally never touched the African continent. No one African benefited from this. But except for us, I guess, as African retailers, and maybe the people who wear it, like that's very low in the value chain. So from the printing of it down to how it was shipped, down to the wholesaler. Like the person who delivered the fabric was an Indian man. So it was just fascinating for me. And I was like, but we're selling this as African fabric, and Africans are not profiting from it. So how African is it? And so I had a very economic interest in that. And sort of that led me down this path of, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, really thinking about, that's actually probably true of many things. When we think about popular culture, how much of the top of the value chain do we own? Like a lot of us are at the creation part, but how much of the rest of it, production, IP, do we actually participate in? And so that's what caused me to be interested in it. And I kind of have been writing about it in different ways. And hopefully we'll pursue further education on it. But yeah, that's how my interest started.
Fantastic. Just one word, one sentence or two sentences about the Wax Print Fest, because that sounds like that's a celebration, or, positive celebration of wax print in Ghana, accepting it now as, part of the cultural heritage. Tell us what that was about. And
Yeah. So, I mean, it's actually not a celebration of wax print. Interestingly enough, it is an interrogation of wax print. And so the whole entire festival includes film, includes exhibitions, includes conversations. It's kind of like a TEDx meets like a Coachella moment, where we're actually able to ask ourselves these questions and challenge ourselves, like fashion designers, scientists. At the last festival, we had people from CSIR, which is a science organization that were making local silk and incorporating that into kente, and talking about like the kente industry and the role that wax print plays in the disruption of that. We also had the chance to talk about the film Wakanda and the IP. So someone in our government, an office in our government, actually sent a letter to Marvel to warn them about correct attribution of kente and other fabrics in the film. And so it's actually an opportunity for us to really interrogate ownership and to sort of like make a declaration on like who we are. And obviously there's no one declaration really that can be made, but it's just a space to really do that work.
That is fascinating. Any chance this will be happening again?
We are certainly hoping so. I think we're
any
hoping
resources on it.
Yeah, we're hoping to have the fabric in the fall, in September. The festival in the fall in September. And so once that is out, right now, if you check the Instagram, we at Wax Print Fest. We'll be making updates at Wax Print Fest for sure. So you can follow us there. And yeah, hopefully we'll be announcing something soon. And if you know of any sponsors or anyone that's interested in supporting, we're always welcome for that.
All right. Thank you so much, Amma. I wish we had more time, but this was very fascinating. Thank you everybody for tuning in. The recording of the Talks Club YouTube channel. You can see in the chat the website and other information. Again, this is Nina Urban for the National Arts Club Fashion Committee. Thank you very much.